Good morning, and welcome to the All Together podcast, your love first connection, anytime, anywhere. Today.Church is meeting this morning at the Ironworks College location at 10 a.m., and we'll be there. The doors open about 9:30, full menu available. And this podcast is to help you stay connected if you can't be there with us all together. And don't forget, next week, we're going to be having a combined worship service with New Hope Baptist Church. We're excited about that. More information will be available. Today.Church is anytime, anywhere, Jesus people gather, love first. We are continuing our verse-by-verse series in 1 Peter, and the topic is living hope in a broken world. And today we are focusing on suffering for doing good. Not a topic that sounds like a good thing, right? I mean, who wants to sign up for that? Suffering for doing good, from 1 Peter 3, 8 through 22. Our vision verse for today, or verses, comes from Romans 5, 3 through 4, where Paul reminds us, not only this, but we also rejoice in sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance, character, and character, hope. You see, suffering is not without purpose. It produces good fruit in our lives. Endurance, character, and ultimately, hope. And so that is the perspective that we're going to be talking about today as we dive into the book of 1 Peter, suffering for doing good. 1 Peter 3, 8 through 22 is what we're focusing on today. This book was written by Peter sometime around AD 60 to 64. It's important to understand that initially, Peter was the apostle or messenger to the Jewish community of believers, but these letters were also for Gentiles. And in the section that we're covering today, Peter encourages all believers to respond to suffering and persecution with good conduct, following the example of Jesus. Verse 8 of 1 Peter 3. In fact, we're going to read through verse 12 to begin with. Finally, all of you must be harmonious, sympathetic, affectionate, compassionate, and humble. Do not return evil for evil or insult for insult, but instead bless others, because you were called to inherit a blessing. Now, before we go on to verse 10, let's unpack this a little bit. Harmonious, in unity, all together, sympathetic, affectionate, compassionate, and humble. That is what the church is supposed to look like. We do not return evil for evil or insult for insult, but instead we bless others no matter what they may do to us. Why? Because we were called to inherit a blessing. And there is a principle in the kingdom that we reap what we sow. And so we don't sow more evil. We don't sow more insult. We don't sow things that are different than what we want to receive. And we were called to inherit a blessing. And that's why we bless others. Verse 10. For the one who wants to love life and see good days must keep his tongue, and I think in our context today that also means our fingertips, his tongue from evil and his lips from uttering deceit. And he must turn away from evil and do good. He must seek peace and pursue it. How do we pursue peace? Well, Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. Peace takes effort. And we are called to love life in such a way that we keep our words away from evil and from uttering things that are untrue and deceit, and turn away from all evil and do good, seeking and making peace. And here's why, verse 12. For the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer, but the Lord's face is against those who do evil. This is why we are called to be harmonious, sympathetic, and affectionate, compassionate, and humble, because that's who God listens to. That's who his ears are open to. And so we must not retaliate with evil or insults, but instead bless others, reflecting the character of Christ, because God is looking for and seeking those who will worship him in spirit and in truth. But his face is against those who do evil. Let's go on to verses 13 and 14. For who is going to harm you if you are devoted to what is good? But in fact, if you happen to suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed. But do not be terrified of them or be shaken. Jesus said that in this world we would suffer persecution, that we would have difficulty. But he said, rejoice and be glad. You see, suffering for doing what is right brings blessing. And we should not be terrified or shaken by difficulty and suffering in our life, or even how we might be treated by other people, but trust completely and fully in God's blessing and protection, because there is blessing on the way for a believer no matter what you are going through. Now, that doesn't mean that things are good, and it doesn't mean that things will always turn out how you expect them to, but we know that God is working all things together for good. And what is temporary here does not compare to what is eternal. But we don't just have a pie in the sky faith where we only expect to be blessed in another life, but we actually receive those blessings here and now. And that's why we don't have to be terrified of the things that the world are terrified of. We don't have to be shaken. We can stand on this firm foundation of hope, realizing that no matter what we are going through, God is taking us to blessing. Okay, let's go on. Verse 15 and 16. But set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the hope you possess. But this is important, verse 16. Yet do it with courtesy and respect, keeping a good conscience, so that those who slander your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame when they accuse you. We must always be ready to explain our hope in Christ, but that is not a confrontation. We need to be able to do so with courtesy and respect. Respect is so rare in our culture today, and Jesus' followers should always reflect respect. We should be ready to explain our hope in Jesus, but only with courtesy and respect. And it's not just about words. Our good conduct should also be evident in the face of slander. Now, there's a phrase that's used here that we're going to see again: a good conscience, keeping a good conscience. If you've ever seen a child who knows that they have done something wrong, a bad conscience leads to more devious behavior. But we have been given a good conscience, a clear conscience, and that is how we rise above the roar of fighting back like the world does. We don't have to, because we have been absolutely forgiven, and set free from our sin. And that's how we set apart Christ in our hearts and how we can be courteous and respectful no matter what. Verse 17, for it is better, now hang on to this, for it is better to suffer for doing good, if God wills it, than for doing evil. Now that seems rather obvious. It's not good to suffer for doing what is wrong, but it is better to suffer for doing good. Why? Verse 18, because Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, to bring you to God by being put to death in the flesh, but by being made alive in the Spirit. You see, it is better to suffer for doing good than for doing evil, because Christ's suffering gives us the example that guides us in our own sufferings. The just for the unjust. Christ did nothing to deserve the punishment that he received. And when we suffer for doing good, in the same way, it's not that we deserve the harsh punishment, but we respond to persecution and difficulty, not as mere humans and not as the world would respond, but following the example of Christ. Now, this next passage is very widely debated and hard to understand. Verse 19, in it, he went and preached to the spirits in prison after they were disobedient long ago, when God patiently waited in the days of Noah as an ark was being constructed. In the ark, a few, that is 8 souls, were delivered or saved through water. Now, verse 19, in fact, also verse 20, difficult passages that have been wrestled with for centuries. The first part, in it, well, that could refer to the being alive in the Spirit from the previous verse. Or it could mean because of this, as a reference to the entire passage of suffering, death, and resurrection, all leading to this. But because of that, and Jesus preached to spirits in prison. Now, that has several interpretations among scholars. Some believe that it refers to Jesus proclaiming victory to fallen angels or demonic spirits after his resurrection. Others think that it signifies Jesus preaching through Noah to the disobedient people of Noah's time. Another interpretation suggests that it symbolized Jesus proclaiming salvation to the righteous dead in Hades. And the question is, which translation, which interpretation of this preaching to spirits in prison is it? Well, with the time we have, just let me say, no one knows for sure, and neither do I. But the important thing is, none of the various interpretations change anything about the actual point being made in these verses, which is leading to an analogy about baptism. And that's what Peter goes on to say in verse 21. And this, that whole process that he's talking about, prefigured baptism. What prefigures baptism? Noah and his family being rescued through water, which now saves you, not the washing off of physical dirt, not the physical things, but the pledge, the answer of a good conscience to God. There's that phrase again. Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who went to heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels and authorities and powers subject to him. So what prefigured baptism? What was a symbol of what baptism means to us? The story of Noah. Christ's resurrection and ascension affirm his victory over all powers. And our baptism symbolizes this victory. But most importantly, it also is an indication of our pledge or our answer of a good conscience to God. A clear conscience is what Hebrews 9 and 10 declares that the old rituals of animal sacrifices could never achieve, because you had to keep repeating those sacrifices over and over again. But Jesus once for all died for sin to prove to us God's love. And baptism is a symbol of that. It is not the physical act, it is not the washing of water, but it is the answer, the pledge of a good conscience to God, realizing that Jesus did for us what we could never do. And we can have a clear conscience, realizing that Jesus paid the price, and we have entire and total forgiveness, grace, and mercy. And so, as it says in Hebrews 10:22, and so let us draw near with a sincere heart, in the assurance that faith brings, because we have had our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed in pure water. Verse 23 says that let us hold unwaveringly to the hope that we confess, for the one who made the promise is trustworthy. You see, it's that clear conscience. It's realizing that Jesus is enough that helps us endure suffering, following his example. We have nothing to make up for. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection gives us the firm foundation of hope that temporary struggle, difficulty, persecution, no matter what anybody does to us, it only leads to eternal blessings, both here and now, and in the kingdom to come. And the clear conscience that we have is the hope and power that we get from Jesus to live differently in this broken world. And Jesus commanded in Matthew 5:10-12, he says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for doing good, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to them. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things about you falsely on account of me." And before we wrap up with verse 12, Jesus teaches us, shows us, and exampled in the way that he lived his life and even the way that he died, that those who are persecuted for righteousness are blessed. And so here's the response to that. Verse 12, "Rejoice and be glad, because your reward is great in heaven, for they persecuted the prophets before you in the same way." We, as Jesus followers, are called to rejoice in suffering, knowing that our reward is not only great in heaven, but suffering for doing good also accomplishes purpose here in this temporary life. It produces the blessings of endurance, character, and ultimately the hope of our great reward in heaven. Bottom line, if you put your faith in Jesus, you are going to make it no matter what. So rejoice. Thank you for joining us for this All Together podcast, your Love First connection, anytime, anywhere. And remember, follow Jesus today. Love first.